Hi, PIHRA members. My name is Crystal Smith, and I am a support staff here at PIHRA. For more information on the Professionals in Human Resources Association, visit www.pyhra.org. Today, I'll be interviewing one of our Legal Update 2017 speakers, Michael Butler. Michael Butler has more than 20 years of experience in the UK, France, and the US as an HR executive and consultant working with companies such as United Airlines and Jones Lang LaSalle. Mike currently advises companies setting up remote sales and IT teams outside of the US on all aspects of international expansion. Mike has both a CIPD, a GPHR, and his MBA. He currently sits on SHRM's Global Executive Panel. Hello, Mike. How are you doing today? And tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do.
Hello, Crystal, and hello, everyone. And it's great to be able to preview this legal update on Europe today. As you can tell, I'm a Brit who's been in the US now for about 2 years in Boston. One of my former companies was not a million miles from where you're sitting today, Crystal, and where we'll be in January, Disneyland Paris. So, to be precise.
Wow, that's interesting.
And of course, big in Anaheim.
That sounds really interesting.
Yes, I mean, there were plenty of anecdotes, interesting anecdotes, and I'll definitely be able to share a few of those with you in January.
Well, I'm sure international HR has thrown some interesting stories for you to share.
Well, yes, indeed, and I can remember my first overseas HR role. I remember thinking how glamorous it was, but I think the honeymoon only lasted a month, and then I wished I'd read the small print. I feel a little bit like that other British import just down the road from you, the Queen Mary in Long Beach. Like the old ship, I definitely have the battle scars of operating overseas.
Well, at least it does qualify you to be a part of the international HR debate.
Well, yes, and if the audience like learning from the battle scars of others, they're probably going to be in the right place.
And speaking of the audience, who do you feel is your intended audience for your legal update presentation?
Yes, well, this session will help both domestic and international HR professionals who have employees or partners in other countries and use employee data from those countries. It'll help them potentially avoid huge fines associated with not complying with new European laws and frameworks. Of course, if they're looking for global credits to cover HR certification, then certainly this session covers some of that body of knowledge.
So what is the essential takeaway for the audience?
Well, it'll help HR practitioners manage that overseas talent smoothly. They'll really have the information to enable them to do what HR does best, in my opinion, asking the right questions, to avoid making assumptions that might overly increase the risk. So this is really about eliminating those surprises. This legal update in January, let's embrace the new legislation out of Europe. That way, HR can avoid disappointing their overseas talent.
So why should the audience be excited to hear your session?
Well, these topics are looking at broader business aspects, and HR can really lead the organization in overseas expansion and operating overseas.
So why is HR so important when it comes down to operating companies overseas?
Good question, but actually quite a simple one. The lion's share of overseas cost is HR related, and that's the good reason.
Wow. Well, and let's get back to legal update and your presentation. What is your presentation style?
Well, I do try and use engaging narratives and stories. My slides, I hope, are very visual rather than bullet points, and I try and make it interactive through a mini quiz at the end of the presentation. I suppose if you combine that with my British-Irish sense of humor, and it hopefully makes for a fun session. Hope you're understanding me, Crystal. But either way, for those who work you know, we work with lots of different accents overseas. It's good practice.
That's a very good point. So let's get down to detail. I'm fascinated with one area that I know you're going to be covering, data protection. Tell me more about that.
Crystal, do you like spy novels?
I do, a little bit.
Well, the current changes could actually be set against the backdrop of events in a spy novel.
Hmm.
Edward Snowden, remember him?
Yes.
Well, his whistleblowing revelations, followed by complaints by Austrian Max Schrems against Facebook, and to cap it all, the historic sort of Brexit referendum, that's raised many questions for US businesses and HR managers, wondering if they've got an adequate level of data protection.
So what is the issue between the EU, the US, in regards to data protection?
Well, historically, the US hasn't been considered by the EU data authorities to have good enough data protection systems in place for the whole of the US. I know California has some great data privacy legislation on record, about having that adequate protection to meet the EU authorities' requirements.
Hmm. So I have heard something about safe harbor. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how that connects to the data protection issues?
Yes, I mean, about 20 years ago, the European Union authorities got together with their US counterparts to really make data transfer from the EU back to the US a lot easier from a compliance perspective. And the safe harbor framework was set up for US companies to apply to join.
Oh, okay. So what about that has changed recently?
Well, back to Edward Snowden, and you know, he fled with these important government secrets, which indicated that the US security authorities would snoop on people's personal data. Whatever people think about his actions, it became a matter of huge concern for the European Union.
And wasn't there an Austrian guy, Max, right, that was kind of stirring the pot on this issue?
18 months, this young Austrian student called Max Schrems, who was concerned by the Snowden allegations, brought a case against Facebook saying that privacy data rights.
So how did it all finish up?
Well, cutting a long story short, this case sort of wound through various legal processes and eventually ended up with the European Court of Justice declaring that safe harbor was no longer safe.
So is there no longer a safe harbor?
Yes, it's no longer a valid means from a compliance perspective for US companies data in the eyes of the EU.
So what are the alternatives here?
Well, we will run through about 4 alternatives in January, but the EU has given notice to avoid incurring financial penalties. HR professionals in the US need to start preparing immediately for the new General Data Protection Regulation, which came in partly in 2016, which will be enforceable in 2018 by law.
Wow. So how much are the fines if that is violated?
Well, 20 million euros, or 4% of the organization's global turnover. And Amazon, that's a lot of money.
Wow. Yeah. It sounds like we needed that information yesterday. Um, I understand that you're also going to be touching on some of the remarkable changes in the way EU companies work and manage life balance. Is that correct?
Yes, the old work-life balance. So a great example of that is countries banning work emails from home, work restrictions. Look, I remember with nostalgia the red glow of a new email on my BlackBerry beckoning from the nightstand in the early 2000s. But the intrusion of work into every nook of life has only really intensified, as you probably know yourself. So trying to compartmentalize work and play is a losing battle. However, some workers, employers, unions, and governments are pushing back. And the French and German companies have been seen to be shutting down the email servers in the evening between certain times.
Very interesting. So this has been really informative and really interesting, but we cannot finish today's conversation without talking about Brexit. What is the likely effect that Brexit is going to impact UK employment law, data protection law in the UK and the EU, and if the UK actually does end up leaving the EU?
Great point, Crystal. That remarkable vote in the middle in June last year. So the big question is whether the UK will try to repeal some of the least popular employment protection rights that came out of the European Union. Mm-hmm. So a great example is employees having the right to reschedule their holiday if they break their arm, say on the beach playing tennis with their child. I know.
I'll be booking a flight to the UK by 2017.
Work for a European, the right company there. But you know, it isn't all good. It'll take many years of scrutinizing what is currently EU-based legislation to consider what legislation it might be appropriate to change. Overnight, when the EU leaves the EU, nothing legally will change except that we'll be able to do our own thing. And I think the idea is business should be simpler, but let's wait and see.
Wow. Well, Mike, thank you so much for this preview of your legal update presentation. Finally, last question. Do you have any mantras that keep you inspired in the field of HR?
Yes, and I mentioned it earlier when I talked about not disappointing your overseas talent, and it is, don't steal the dream of your overseas talent.
Well, that's very inspirational. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience who have listened today. We hope that you guys will register for Legal Update as soon as possible. We hope we have given you a taste of what you're going to be getting. And we look forward to reconvening in January.
Thank you. See you in January.